All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Christian Alvarado, and I'm the Peer Learning Manager at the Children in Nature Network. I'm glad you're all here with us today. Welcome to our Designing Community Strategies and Building Cross-Sector Teams event. We'd love to know more about your familiarity with nature everywhere before we get started. Your participation in our meeting poll would help us understand where you may be. Are you a seedling, sapling, or a tree? Let us know. All right, so with the 31 votes in that we received, it looks like 45% of you are seedlings, 35% are saplings, and 19% are trees. The good thing is that anyone joining us today will be getting some great information. And we will also be linking some more information about the Introduction to Nature Everywhere event later in the session. I want to start by respectfully acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the unceded land of the Tungus, Quinnipiac, and Wapingur peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We invite you to share the Indigenous land history of your location in the chat. If you're not familiar with the history of your location, you can learn about Indigenous territories and land with the Native Land Map. We're sharing a link in the chat. In addition to land acknowledgements, here are some ways that you can support Indigenous peoples every day. Learn about those Indigenous homelands you're on and normalize land acknowledgements. Educate yourself on Indigenous issues. Amplify Indigenous social media accounts to reshare and amplify Indigenous voices year-round. And support Indigenous causes and businesses. For those who are joining us for the first time, you may have missed our first information session on the Introduction to Nature Everywhere. The recording is now available, and the link will be in the chat. The session highlighted strategies from the Connecting Children Connecting, Cities Connecting Children to Nature initiative, our partnership with the National League of Cities, about what it takes to achieve and scale transformational change. We also provided an overview of Nature Everywhere, including details of the application process and the 2-year engagement process that includes vision labs, technical assistance, peer learning, and funding opportunities. I'm also excited to introduce our speakers that will be joining us shortly. Priya Cook, who's the Director of Green Schoolyards and Communities here at Children in Nature Network, and Wilford Pinkney Jr., who's the Director of Office of Violence Prevention at the City of St. Louis. But before we start with our speakers, we'd like to share a recording from Cities Connecting Children to Nature. Over the last 8 years, our team leaders have answered the call when we want their peers to learn from them. In an effort to be respectful of their time, we are sharing a recording to give you insights on conversations that we've been able to have internally with CCCN. This also provides insights into the type of network your team will be a part of through Nature Everywhere. In this clip, Maria Durana, who is the lead in San Francisco and director of the San Francisco Children in Nature Collaborative, shares insights into their strategies and cross-sector team.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maria. I am the director of the San Francisco Children in Nature Collaborative, and I work out of the San Francisco Recreation and Parks Department. But I've been very committed to this initiative and especially to working within our early childhood teams. And so happy to be here to share some of the things that we've learned along the way, being part of the CCCN initiative since 2017. So we have been part of the Cities Connecting Children to Nature program since its start. We were accepted as one of the first 7 cities and gathered our collaborative team and launched in 2017. So now we're happy to be part of a collection of cities that are working together with us. It really has been great to be able to be part of this larger collective, partners in thought, partners in ideas. It's been really nice to be able to connect with the CCCN team and follow some of this guided thought process around this work, but also to be able to hear from the many different things that are happening across the country and really be inspired by the work of the other cities. So we really appreciated being part of this process. This process didn't start for us in 2017. Like many of our organizations had already been working to connect children with nature in San Francisco. So we did have a head start and a collection of agencies and organizations, that was easy to sort of align all of our different efforts from our national parks, city parks, our YMCA's, healthy parks, healthy people initiatives to try to all of us work a little bit collectively, more efficiently, and perhaps sharing resources across our organizations. And we are structured in 3 different working groups. We have our community and youth engagement working group. We have our nature connection design team. So they're all planners and designers that are thinking about how to connect kids with nature from a design perspective and placemaking. And we have our early childhood education team. So we have the benefit of not just having our early childhood cohort, but we're also learning from our different working groups and are able to share resources across our working teams. Just to look a little bit more specifically about who is on our early childhood team, this is our current lineup of people. We have the museum, California Academy of Science, folks that work in early childhood. In blue, we have representation from our providers. Some of them are larger organizations like the YMCA that has many childcare centers across the city, but there's also representation from family childcare homes. We have some nonprofit partners like Tandem Partners in Early Learning that's focused on literacy, some organizations that are focused on providing more resources to early childcare. We have from the government, our Department of Early Education, myself from San Francisco Rec and Park, other collaborators and the school district, and a funding partner from the Low Income Investment Fund, who's in charge of investments into the facilities of early childhood. So it's been fantastic to have them involved as well. And they have really shifted the way that they do funding, especially in outdoor spaces, to ensure that any new investments include nature connection as part of those projects. Just a little bit of time to share some of the highlights. When we began our effort, we began with a schoolyard assessment and a teacher assessment just to understand where our starting point was. It was a survey that was distributed to early childhood centers that really helped us understand that there was a disparity in nature access across the city that related specifically to some of our more underserved neighborhoods. And it really created the case for what we had to do as a team. 100% of the respondents agreed that nature connection was really important, agreed that early childhood professionals was their job to provide these experiences, but didn't necessarily have all the resources. Loose parts nature play. This is an easy place to start because all it really is taking advantage of free materials and perhaps free labor. These are some college students that help us create with nature kits that could be used in schools, that could be used for park programming, and that we shared as well with some of the early childcare centers that we were working with each year. This was a way to bring nature into places where there might not be easy access to nature, but also a way to bring people into the fold, to have people understand what we were about and start creating relationships. It helped us connect with, say, the botanical gardens that can now let us know when there's leftover materials like the bamboo that is being culled from their exhibit every year. We also took our nature play activities out into community events, which helped us outreach to parents and the various organizations that show up to support those events, and helped us strengthen our relationships with partners like the library, where now when they host Dia de los Niños, Dia de los Libros, a literacy-focused event, we can create an overarching theme of nature. And all the giveaways were nature books, we had seed planting kits, we had maps to some of our parks. So it was a nice way for us to use our goals and align them to help support nature connection and kids and the organizations that run youth programs in the city. How we see this within early childhood is the new projects that are coming up, and the new site renovations are all including and are all putting nature forward features from the start as part of the design. This is working through the Low Income Investment Fund, who funded, along with our Department of Education, 9 play spaces last year, 5 family childcare homes, and 4 early childcare centers. And just to share some of the ripples of this work, we have seen the parks now start to repurpose natural materials that then go into childcare sites. This helps connect relationships between parks and childcare as a result of being able to connect across agencies, aligning with mutually beneficial goals.
Maria shared a few great strategies that her and her team have focused on. We also hear the importance of building cross-sector teams to help lift this work. With that in mind, I'd like to welcome Priya and Will. Thank you for joining us today. Will, I'd love to know more about the work your team has done in the city of St. Louis. And Priya will have a few follow-up questions for you as well.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. You know, outdoor and being out in nature is really important, as you all know. And it's very important in a city like St. Louis that deals with a lot of violence, that deals with historical disinvestment in communities. And so when I came into my role at the time as the director of the Mayor's Office of Children, Youth, and Families, I was tasked with developing relationships. And that resulted in me bringing together people who hadn't been brought together before. And we created a collaborative in the midst of the pandemic as we were dealing with a multitude of issues, as many of you have and did. And so we created this sort of big tent, right? And the whole goal was to think about equitable access to the outdoors and how the outdoors could help us engage youth and their families and address the trauma related to violence. And so when you think about putting together, and when we thought about putting together this collaborative, we really didn't specifically say, hey, we want people from these types of organizations. They just started to come, right? As we started to meet, as I put out the word that we were looking to really expand our connections to nature in the city, we started to bring in people like the zoo. We have a very large park in the city of St. Louis called Forest Park, and there's a private organization that manages it called Forest Park Forever. They came in, the Botanical Garden. We had some national partners like the Nature Conservancy. We had the National Park Service because we have the arch grounds in the city. We had the Environmental Education Association from Missouri. We had our sewer district. One of our health systems has a community health entity, and so we brought that person in. We brought in the state parks. We brought in a nonprofit foundation that deals with summer programming, and they create information and distribute information called Blueprint for Summer that talks about access to summer parks and engagement. And so all of those people are types of people that really came into this. When we first came together, the public schools had already been discussing a green schoolyard project. And the collaborative was really helpful in really aligning that work with the other partners in the city. And one thing that came out of that was an equity tool. And so you can do one green schoolyard, but now how do you think about how to do the rest? My office, the purpose of creating my office at that time was to make sure we had some equitable access to any resources in the city, and we elevated children and families in our approach to all the work we do in the city. And so that equity tool was something that came out of input for those multiple partners coming together, and the school district being open to saying, hey, this is something we're doing, but we want to be as collaborative as possible. I think when you think about the sustainability of these groups, right, I think one thing I would say is important is to remember you don't need everybody at every meeting. And sometimes we get caught up in that if people don't show up, we think the collaboration's falling apart. And so everybody comes with a different set of expertise and values and lenses. And you want to be really clear on what you're doing and who's needed, but make sure you continue to communicate with people. You see some pictures on the slide around the group coming together and some of our collaborative partners. The one in the top left was a meeting we had actually after we hadn't met for like a couple of months. And we sort of came back together at the zoo. They have an educational area in the zoo here in St. Louis. And we met up to sort of like revisit what we were doing, talk about how we need to communicate and, start to build on this early successes we had. In the bottom left, you see us. We visited with one of our partners across the river. We're in a regional area where you have two states that come together. And we had a partner that even came from Illinois, even though we're in St. Louis and in Missouri, and was engaging us, even though some of our kids travel out there, but they don't engage with them every day, but they wanted to also be a part of the collaborative. So we went out there. You see in the two pictures on the right, one of the things that came out of it was also an outdoor learning toolkit. We brought together many partners. The school district was looking for input, and we went around to some different schools to see how they were engaging kids outside the schools. And our partners came together and developed this learning toolkit that was really useful. And you'll see on the right side, the elements of the toolkit and sort of notes for teachers and how to utilize the pieces in the toolkit. So that just shows you a little bit how as you build this big tent, how you can create this alignment and strategies. We also have, I think Maria talked about repurposing natural materials. We have an outdoor learning work group as part of this collaborative, and they worked to get 25 stumps from our forestry department to repurpose for seeding, and they gave that out free to 6 different schools, right? So just building on what she's talking about. So these are some of the strategies that can come out of it. Now, the value and the impact. I think it allows us, when we have these collaboratives, to quickly respond to needs. I talked about how this came together in the pandemic, and obviously there was a lot of stuff going on, and we saw a intensity of needs and an intensity to meet needs that were exacerbated by the pandemic. So we realized children were going to be in the house a lot. And so we had 2 working groups in our collaborative. We still do, the curriculum committee and the outdoor learning environment committee. But we had all these people come together to say, hey, if we have these kids inside the house all the time, how can we make sure we still are promoting that access to outdoors and healthy lifestyles and deal with trauma? And they came up with what you see on the right side, which is the 10 easy ways to explore the outdoors. And the focus here is, what can young people do in their house, in their backyard, in the front, if you're in the urban area, right in front of their house, right playing in the street or on the sidewalk. And so this was really a great tool and impact that came out of this, in that we were able to translate this into about 6 different languages that are relevant to all communities in our city. And it really showed the breadth of knowledge and expertise and how you can leverage that in creating something that is tangible and it can be given out to families. On the left side, you see that outdoor learning environment group. Green schoolyards are big projects, and you can't always do a big project, right? Or they don't happen quickly. So they started, they brought together some data, right? Because data is a big part of this. They utilized the Park Serve score, some city data and maps to identify 5 priority neighborhoods. And then they started meeting with schools as a group in these different neighborhoods to see what they had in terms of spaces outside the school that kids can engage. They help you see on the left side there with, community flower gardens, community gardens, or food gardens outside schools. And they would go around and engage the principals and the students and the staff and help brainstorm ways to activate those spaces in different ways. And so this is something else you see, is that's a real impact in real time. You obviously break down silos by identifying where conversations are taking place. We're big here in that we don't want to create another table when there are tables available. So how can we either bring people to a table or join tables? And so that's really been helpful in making sure we can do things like this. We can build capacity. I can tell you, bringing together all of these partners, they all had professional development opportunities available. And what wound up happening was our rec centers, who are often are undersourced in our city and often undersourced in other cities, they were able to provide free professional development to our rec staff for things like doing flower gardens. We had archery, we had fishing. We had all these things that our partners did that were more focused on connecting people to outdoors. that now our rec center staff could get, so that once again, now the youth that attend those rec centers can have access to those services for free, and that many times they often don't. And so you can see a lot of ways that you can have impact in these collaboratives. And then I think when we think about the green schoolyards and we think about partnerships, I think it's important to really think as you create things and as you have these conversations, you create things for people, not sectors or systems. We always try to make sure we come back to in our meetings and as we engage with each other that what we do is for young people and their families. We even created a mission and vision for the collaborative, and we created mission statements for each of the work groups and some objectives, right? But we wanted to make sure we continued to center people. So those are just some things to think about as you are thinking about these collaboratives, and these are some of the things we're doing in St. Louis.
Thanks, Will. That was terrific. And I know that there's been a lot of enthusiasm and deeper questions about some of the things that you mentioned. So I want to jump into that with some of these questions in hand from the chat that I know Aaron and Christian are filtering for us. To start, to go way back to the beginning, you started, one of the first things you mentioned was some of the challenges and priorities that you're working on in St. Louis. And to start on a personal note, I'm really curious if you could share with us why you are so invested in equitable nature connection individually in your role in the mayor's office of violence prevention. I think for many people on the call, that might not be in an intuitive place where they would look for leadership on this issue.
So I'll give a little personal, and I'll give I think it's connected, right? I grew up in the Bronx. I grew up in projects in the Bronx. So I grew up in the urban area. I grew up in the late 60s. I'm going to tell my age now. I grew up in the late 60s and 70s in New York City, which will tell you, if you're old enough, a lot about what was going on there in terms of violence and blight and a lot of issues that I think are represented in St. Louis. So, for me, but I was always outside. I could always be outside. I could ride my bike. I could, probably shouldn't have been doing it, but as a young child, I was taking the train in places. And that was really helpful to me, I think, in just growing up and having a good childhood and not feeling stressed and all of that, right? And I would say the other piece of it that brings me to nature is that my grandmother was born in North Carolina. And so I spent a lot of my summers in North Carolina because my grandmother raised me a lot. My mother was working. And so, and her family down there were tobacco farmers and pig farmers. And so I spent a lot of time in the summers outside learning about these things that I didn't know about in the city. So I was fortunate to have, the best of both worlds. And I think for me, it's always been since then important that young people have those experiences. So in the terms of my new role as the director of the Office of Violence Prevention, when I look at what happens in cities, first of all, violence keeps kids inside. There's a lot of great parks. St. Louis scored really well on park scores here. But if kids can't go out and go in a park, that's a problem. So I think the example that I think that really, conceptualizes this is we do something called kickbacks, where we go to communities where there's violence once a month, and we bring a DJ and food and resource providers around violence prevention. And so we had one in a park in the area that had been experiencing a lot of violence. And when people were setting up, the kids came over and asked what was going on. And we were like, hey, we're going to be out here and you can come get free food and blah, blah, blah. And the kids ran back yelling, hey, we can go to the park today. It's going to be safe. That tells you why you should engage someone who's in violence prevention, because that's what we want. We want to create safe spaces. We want kids to be able to be kids. And those kids didn't have that opportunity.
Thanks, Will. And I'm going to zoom out from there to maybe have you speak for some of these other partners that you were mentioning. But, you were talking about your sewer district partners, public health partners, parks partners, nonprofit organizations, organizations that provide programming. And, if I were to ask them that same question, like, what brings you to this table? Like, why are you part of this initiative? I'm sure they will answer that really differently. Though, certainly there'd be overlap. sometimes this can feel really messy to have so many different people and organizations with different priorities and values that are bringing them into that shared space. Can you speak to like maybe a little bit of the messiness, keep it real, but also, what's been the value of having all those partners together?
So I think the initial messiness or challenge is people trying to figure out why they're there or not understanding why they're there because you're not used to engaging in that way. And yeah, you're talking about all these things, but I don't do these things. So I don't know, not in a bad way, but like, I don't know that there's any way I can help here, right? I think I think part of that is organizations oftentimes are looking to get more kids to come to where they are. Our approach in the city, especially through my Office of Violence Prevention now, is to be more place-based, right? We want to get stuff to where kids are because every kid can't get to where the zoo is or where, the arch grounds are. I will say many of those organizations had the ability to bring kids there. And because there wasn't this collaboration, people didn't know about that. And so they had money that was left on the table because, hey, we can bring a bunch of kids here. We have funding for transportation, but nobody knows, and it becomes inequitable because people who are connected to children in certain communities don't know, right? So there wasn't a lot of alignment around everybody's looking to engage more kids. Everybody's creating spaces where they are to engage kids. And believe it or not, they all are willing to support people who are engaging kids. So it wasn't really any resistance around, hey, how can you come out to X neighborhood to engage our kids? There wasn't at all. There just wasn't an opportunity for them to do that. There wasn't that connection to know who do we connect with to make that happen. And so there wasn't a whole lot of messiness, I would say, in our experience. I think the bigger challenge is how do you communicate with everybody? How do you keep everybody informed? And that is a challenge at times, depending on the resources you have, right? I have my office, the Children, Youth, and Families, was the office of one, like many of you know. But I did bring in practicum students. And when I had those young people helping me out, having them do minutes, sending out minutes after every meeting. There were numerous times we would engage people to say, hey, just want to check and make sure people get too many emails. Do you still want to be on this email list? And people say, no, yeah, I definitely want to stay on. I'm seeing the notes. Thanks a lot. It's going well. So sometimes you think people don't feel like they're valued or valuable, but it's just that checking in every once in a while.
Thanks. One thing that also I think picked up a lot of interest here in the audience was when you were mentioning the equity tool. And just as that question came in, I don't know if you were telepathic or if you saw it in the chat, but you actually went into some more detail already about the equity tool that you referenced. And we know you mentioned using indicators like Trust for Public Lands, Park Score, and others. But when we talk about assessments and equity tools, I think this is another prime example of how partners really are collaborating to make a statement about values, right? When you're trying to measure for equity and you're trying to do an assessment about need and how to prioritize your precious resources, those indicators that you focus on are really a reflection of what each organization and person values in that work together and what they want to see come out of it. So I was just wondering if you could take us a little deeper into that and if you could say more about how partners defined equity and those indicators and what that process was like as a partnership.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times is who you bring to the table, who does that work. So, and I know I'm not going to remember this now. There was an organization that focuses on, oh my God, I can't remember. We have an organization, I can't remember the name of it, I know it's going to escape me. We had an organization here that did a lot in the community around equity. And that's who we engaged around helping to create the equity tool. So you need to have conversations, but you also want to bring somebody to bear that has that experience and knows your city, because they work out in the community regularly and they know the issues related to inequity so that it can help us. So that was a big part of the process. I think the first thing was to raise the question, and this is the question I raised when I first learned about the Green Schoolyard program, is Well, you planning to do other schools, how are you going to make that decision? Right. And so the first thing is asking the questions and getting people to think. And it wasn't that the school district, because I was very close with the superintendent, didn't care about equity, but you got a lot of things going on and you don't often have that support. And especially when you're a large school district, a superintendent may be thinking about that, but there may be some assumptions of what's happening in middle management or in the front lines. And so when I engaged the superintendent around it and just started raising those questions, he was concerned about it. He did want to make sure that as they move, to different schools or different projects, that they were thinking about it in an equitable way. Because the first school district the first school building that they were doing it in, while it was deserving, some people would rightfully look at that and say, maybe that wasn't the place that we needed to do it first, but a lot goes into that, right? How many students are in the school, the viability of that school long-term, because you don't want to create a green schoolyard project. And then that school is going to close. And now you may not have served as many people as you want. So we I came in as, I guess, an eye that wasn't involved in the main process and started asking a lot of questions about how did you do this? Why are you doing this? And what does this mean? And then pointing out, well, what about these other communities, right? So I think that's the main thing. And when you think about schools, depending on your city, or whether it's on a decline or increasing population, that's going to feed into it too, because that feeds into what the sustainability of the school and the spaces. And then obviously the connections to the community, because that was another piece of it. How you connected to the community. They did a great job prior to me even becoming involved in creating the collaborative and engaging the community. Now they engaged that community in that school that they picked. But the question is, how do you engage other communities in understanding how you pick the next school? And so the equity tool is not just about one space, it's about the broader city as a whole. So hopefully that's helpful.
No, that's really helpful. And I think, I just want to highlight some of the things you said, because it's all kind of beautifully woven together. But I think some things that were really important that I want to ensure the audience also heard is that in your answer, you talked about actually the benefit of maybe you having an outside or like citywide perspective. So you weren't into the nitty-gritty of, picking the school sites or what the mechanics are of rolling that out. And that gave you an advantage in terms of asking these important questions. So that's just an example of what a possibly not typical partner could bring to this process. I also heard you mention early, I know I was also trying to remember the name of the organization you worked with, but I couldn't, but that you had a partner in the process who brought that expertise in facilitating equity-focused conversation, which can be fraught, which can be difficult and challenging, but really important. So, that's another thing for everyone who's thinking about their partnerships. That's expertise that's really wonderful to have on your team. And then you also talked about systems change. And when you're talking about any place-based strategy, it's always easy to go for that low-hanging fruit, or where there's a willing partners or people leaning into it or asking for it. But that often that doesn't lead to an equitable outcome. And so really appreciate that this process you're talking about helped ensure that equity stayed at the forefront of the decisions that were being made and where the resources are going. And I also just want to give thanks and kudos to Will. I also want to shout out here that one piece of the peer learning network that exists around all the communities working, whether it's through Cities Connecting Children to Nature or Looking Forward into Nature Everywhere, we are often just lifting up the good work that communities themselves are doing. And so the equity tool that Will spoke of, along with some examples from Chicago's Space to Grow Green Schoolyards program and a Minnesota assessment, were actually all key source examples in a site selection tool that Children and Nature Network helped to develop. So, this kind of work spreads ripples even beyond your city. We've used that in other cities as well, who are trying to think about how to prioritize and select sites. So.
Oh, I did remember, is
Mm.
RISE. RISE was
Oh,
the name
yeah.
of the organization. They were a community development organization that had did a lot of work across the city as a whole. So they were the perfect partner because they knew a lot about, communities, housing, about inequities related to income and census tracts, poverty indicators. So they used a lot of that stuff. They had a lot of information about building codes, utilization, blight, and all that. So they were the ones. And one other thing I did forget, and I think another impact really quickly is our curriculum committee brought together the school district, and it was led by someone from the Botanical Gardens and their educational department, and the curriculum developer for the district brought together all the partners, and they created an outdoor science curriculum for kindergarten, first, second, and fifth grades that was able to be shared not just in the district, but with other school districts. And so they built it to the national standards for the state. So right there, that's another impact that, a collaborative like this, maybe they would have done it without the collaborative, the school district, but it might not have been as comprehensive and impactful as it was based on that group coming together. So I'm sorry, those are two things.
No, that's great. You've yet again pulled in one other great example, like the public housing. And if I'm remembering, RISE had some actually strong relationships too with communities in which that you were seeking to engage. So that was also really important. And the longer we let you talk, I think, Will, the more this ecosystem is unfolding of all these ripples and ways at the state level, national, local, that your work is really impacting others. So thank you for sharing that. I want to make sure that the audience also has time to hear answers to their most pressing questions. I'm going to pass it over to Christian, who's going to help us facilitate that part.
Yeah, thank you both. Will, I think it's great to hear the story of St. Louis and how nature shows up in your community. When we met to prepare for this, I was really excited about just letting people hear all it is that you guys are working on, and it's very important work. We definitely like to move forward to the audience Q&A space. So thank you for anyone who's been sending questions. We do encourage you to ask more as it relates to kind of building cross-sector teams or even strategies, especially for anyone who's looking to apply to the Nature Everywhere process. If you have any of those questions that you're thinking about before you hit that submit button, definitely be sure to ask those questions, and we'll try to address them in the chat and in the discussion. We have a question from Kendall. Has anyone included elected officials in their coalitions, and how could they contribute in your view?
That's for me.
Either Will or Priya could
Okay.
could answer that. Yeah.
So I would say not directly in the collaborative, because there's always that balance between politics and policy and getting things done. And even for me, I think one point that Priya made, I think I didn't make it as well as she did, and I should have, is that you do want to have a neutral convener, but as the person who's coming in from the city side to try and help facilitate these conversations, these initiatives, you also don't want to make it about you. You want to make it about the work. And sometimes when you engage elected officials, it becomes more about whatever political lens people are using. So I would be very careful how you engage them in the day-to-day conversations of a collaborative, but you do need them as allies, right? So you should be inviting them as you're doing things. And obviously if there's a need for funding around something, then you want to do that. I mean, they always engage me to say, what do you need, when they see things that they like going on? And so you want to be able to answer that question.
And I'll pile on there, and with maybe a slightly, I think this is a very local answer. There's some places where what Will's saying is super important about like a neutral kind of facilitator or convener. We've worked with communities where maybe the council and the mayor have a very fraught relationship, and it's not helpful for an initiative to look like the mayor's signature initiative. In other cases, mayors often, one of their superpowers is, we always talk about their superpower to convene. So when you have folks who are like, children in nature, that's not what I do, kind of like what Will was saying before. Sometimes, even the easy work of, having a mayor be willing to be the convener, have the message and the invitation to join come from them or their office. A lot of times it's not the mayor or the council members directly participating in those frequent meetings, but a lot of times it's like keeping that channel of communication open. We've seen teams that have like a standing bi-monthly check in with the mayor's policy advisors so that they're always aware of what's on the policy landscape and where there's points of connection and they're mutually informing each other. We've seen, I'll call out, shout out really, Cincinnati, Councilmember Mika Owens has been working on the Green Cincinnati plan, and that's been a key point of connection for their Green Schoolyards work, and building Green Schoolyards as a strategy into their Green Cincinnati plan. So I think, and the other thing I would say is that elected officials, where they may not show up directly in the day-to-day work, this is not their best role. However, often the ability of their staff team, which depending on city size can be quite limited, just the ability of them to commit staff time to support that is, I think, also a really important contribution. So those are just a few of the ways we've, seen elected leaders be an important part of this.
That's great. And I think that leads us to our actual next question that I wanted to bring up. So based on your experiences in this type of collaborative work, what has been the time commitment for you or other organizational partners?
It's probably not as much as you think. I mean, the meetings we had, we were meeting monthly originally. I think we went recently to like bi-monthly or quarterly, but we meet monthly for an hour. I can tell you sometimes it went over and people weren't in a rush to leave. So that's always a good sign because you don't feel like you're wasting people's time. I think outside of that, I mean, depending on who you engage, I talked a lot about the outdoor learning group and learning environment group. Well, many of those people who attended those types of engagements that were happening in between the meetings, that's what they do. So they're out in community anyway. So, and they're supporting organizations or communities. And so they may meet for an hour like that, but I don't know that they see that as an onerous commitment. But yeah, I mean, generally for me, it was the meetings. My staff, like I said, when I had the practicum student, was how much time it took them to do the notes. But that was really it. It's not as much time as you think. So yeah, it's about how much you do.
And just to pile on a recommendation there, where possible, one success we've seen where cities or teams have had a small amount of funding, anywhere in like $10,000 to $50,000 range, there's always a temptation to have immediate impact and to install something and, physically transform a space. A lot of times we've seen people make really great progress using that to bring some capacity to their team. So if there isn't someone who has enough alignment with the work to coordinate, because a lot of the relationship cultivation, the staying in touch, Will's talked a little bit about some fellows and strategies he's brought to support just the massive amount of work that he's carrying, even in addition to this. Sometimes those temporary part-time coordinator roles have expanded and ultimately been made the case for having like a staff person, whether that's in parks or the school district or somewhere else. Maria, who presented, is evidence of that. That was a short-term contract coordinator role in San Francisco, and the work she began leading and coordinating was so impactful that it became clear that that was necessary to continue.
Yeah, I think just being clearly defining what you're doing, like we set goals, like I said, we had objectives. Those work groups met once a month as well, in addition to the once a month bigger meeting, but you can space those out how you need to. So I think that's the key. You really got to set clear goals, and the time commitment is going to be related to that.
Great. We have a question here. Will, can you talk more about how to get families involved in the community or families involved along with their kids outside of school?
Yeah, and that word community is always interesting, because you can sometimes that word community just means the people that the same 10, 15, 50 people that we always see, and we're always trying to move beyond that. I think you have to I go back to something we talked about and Priya mentioned as well. You want to connect with organizations that have relationships already. And so what I often did in the beginning was I would go to those engagements and have them either speak to or allow me to speak to what was going on and get feedback on what people were looking for. When you're dealing with schools, it's a little easier because hopefully there's a good relationship between the schools and the youth and their families. So, a lot of what happened through the collaborative was engaging families in that way. And then, you want to create opportunities. So I talked about Forest Park Forever. They created something called the Nature Playscape. If you Google it and look it up, it's a great place within this big park in St. Louis that's free to go to, and it's all natural. It's where they repurpose natural materials, and it's just a great calming space to be in. So what we did was we worked through the collaborative with schools to create trips to that space for families to build those relationships. So you want to do something like families in most cities like this are always ask questions, right? People give a bazillion surveys and things to figure out what they want, but they don't often do things. You want to engage families, do something, have something where they're actually engaged and active. And that's the best way. It's not easy. It's not simple. There's going to always be people you don't get. But, like I told you about the kickbacks, that's why we do it. We want to engage people. If people can see you, they know you're around. They know you're around when something bad didn't happen. Instead of just responding when something bad happens, they will get engaged. But it takes time to build that trust and that relationship.
I think, Will, something you said earlier in the discussion also relates to this about flipping the idea of trying to get families and community members to come to your program or to your place, and instead going to where they already are. Schools are an obvious one, childcare places, like neighborhood, very local spaces. I think that's part of this answer too.
Yeah, we're good for we'll pick a block, shut it down, and bring stuff and be right in the middle of the community. So people can't help but come by and they're wondering what's happening. And, oh, that's free? Yeah, it's free. We're doing this for free because they're not used to that. So
Free is always a good benefit.
Definitely.
We had a question for you, Will, that is just saying, can we see the curriculum that you referenced? Along with that, I can say, if there are any other resources that we shared today that Will is willing to share, we will definitely follow up with you guys when we send out the recording. If there's any specific documents that are public and available, we will definitely send that out.
Yeah, and I'll definitely look into if we can share that. Like I said, I don't think there wouldn't be a reason they couldn't. It was aligned to the state standards. It was done collaboratively. So yes, just follow up with me. I'll follow up and check and getting that to share out.
Great. Before we wrap up, are there any other last minute questions that we have for Will or Priya before we finish off this session?
I think Ursula has a question.
Okay, Ursula. Okay, looks like we actually were able to respond just because that was outside of the scope of this session. This might be a good resource for you, Ursula. The Youth Outdoor Equity Leadership Fund that might be available for your daughter and anything that she might be working on. All right. If there are no other questions, I want to thank you, Priya and Will, for your time today. I also want to thank Maria for the great work that she was doing with our team in CCCN. We will try our best to get any of those resources to you in the follow-up email. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, for your participation, the great questions, the comments. And of course, we want to announce that the request for application for Nature Everywhere is now open through August 25th. So make sure if you have any questions that you can send that out to us at nature_everywhere at Children in Nature Network, choseninnature.org, before you apply if you have any additional questions. We also invite you to stay engaged by joining upcoming Children in Nature Network events. We have an upcoming event on September 7th, Back to School with Nature, supporting social, emotional learning and academic outcomes. And as a reminder, we'll be emailing a link to this session as a follow-up with any resources once it's available, so you can revisit the conversation and share it with others. Thank you again for your participation. Have a good day.